So our next speaker is Kari D. Weaver. She's an assistant professor of library science and the library instruction coordinator at the Gregg Graniteville Library in the University of South Carolina, Aiken. Is that said? Aiken is right?
Aiken is right.
Okay,
yeah.
Terrific. She earned a BA in English from Indiana University and her MLIS from the University of Rhode Island. Ms. Weaver has presented in a number of venues around the country and recently co-authored the article, Embedded Information Literacy in the Basic Oral Communication Course, From Conception Through Assessment, in the journal Public Services Quarterly. She holds a particular interest in examining information literacy instruction, assessment, and student learning outcomes within the communication, business, and gender studies disciplines. Kari?
Okay, so I was just saying, I love the last comment about the focus maybe needing to be on the librarian when we think about assessment. I will make a case to you that this is one of the potential ways we can do that today, so keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay, so traditional assessments, I took this job at the University of South Carolina, Aiken at the beginning of the 2010-2011 school year. Before that, I was at Wartburg College in Waverly, Iowa. And in this role, I am responsible for all of the assessment that we do with the instruction program and most of the assessment that we do in the library as a whole. And what I figured out is that as librarians, we like to count everything. We are completely obsessed with this idea of counting the number of instruction sessions, the number of students that come through the doors, the circulation numbers, everything. So much of our assessment revolves around counting. And you heard I was an English major. I hate numbers, so I didn't want to spend all of my time counting in taking on this role. And really, you know, when you're doing the quantitative measures, you're getting kind of a really broad perspective of what's happening. You're not really getting super deep into what's happening with students when they're in that zone of doing the research and figuring out all of these problems that they run into. And when you look at what's happening sort of traditionally in the academy, you find that a lot of the assessments there have been built around testing, and percentage basis and grades and so forth. So what we were doing in the library and what was happening kind of in the academy kind of aligned with one another. But this has changed somewhat. When you look at what is actually happening now, what people are being asked to do, our colleagues out there, the teaching faculty, they've been asked to make some changes to that and move more in the direction of doing some different types of assessment, things that ask students to directly apply learning. Things like case studies, group projects, things that require students to apply what they have learned to demonstrate their ability in some way. Well, okay, so we haven't done that. I mean, that's basically the long and short of it, is that we haven't sort of figured out how to adapt these things to what we're trying to do and to our assessment techniques. And I see that as a problem. I see that as a huge problem, especially if we're being asked to align with what everybody else is doing. So, reflective journaling. In my mind, this is the answer. I've worked with pre-tests and post-tests. I've worked with rubrics. I think I've gone through the gamut in my library career of all of the things that you can do with assessment. None of them are bad. None of them will get you the full story. But I think that reflective journaling is really the way to get very deeply at what students are experiencing while they are doing research and what they are learning. When I started thinking about doing this, I was doing a lot of reading and trying to figure out how I could implement this. And I kept running across sort of a statement in all of the literature I was reading that said that learning is an internal process. And I became really obsessed with this idea, because if it's an internal process, how the heck am I supposed to assess what's happening to them internally? I don't know. But what I figured out I could do, and what I found when I went out there, is that this reflective journaling, I could ask them to tell me about their process while they were going through it by working with professors, creating prompts that students had to provide written responses to, or some sort of response. Written is not always required. And that I could ask them specifically about how they were doing their research, what approach they were taking, what sources they were using, how they were staying motivated to do this, how they figured out what kind of question to ask, all of these things. And I could ask them about how they were compiling everything and synthesizing it into some sort of package. So there are a lot of benefits to doing this. It builds on those trends that are already happening in academia. This is that me generation of students. They really love themselves, so they are completely willing to tell you all about what is happening with them. This is one of the things that I've discovered by doing this. It provides a consistent feedback loop. The way you're going to set this up is you're going to work with a faculty member to have students do some reflection at least 3 times during a semester. Maybe during 6 weeks when they're engaged in a research project. If it's a semester-long research project, you can spread it out. But at least 3 times, you're going to ask them to reflect on their experience and where they are in their experience. And that is going to create a feedback loop. The students are going to tell you about your experience. They're going to ask you questions when they are telling you about your experience. And that is your opportunity and the professor's opportunity to respond to those questions and problems that students have identified. It also gives you the chance to see trends across a class. So if you see, in a class of 30 students, 20 of them are really racking their brains about something you discussed, maybe you need to discuss that again. I had one class where I was doing this, and students were really struggling with citations, which has already been identified as a common problem this morning. And the students actually, several of them must have gotten together and put in their reflections, "We'd like Professor Weaver to come to class on our peer editing day. Can you do that?" Yes, I'd love to do that. I'd be happy to do that. But we never would have known that if we hadn't asked the students to tell us. Okay, so what can one of these things look like? This is a sample of an actual prompt that I have used with a class. This is an initial prompt, and I will say this is a senior level business class that I was working with in this case. So when I'm doing this with, like, say, our freshman composition classes, they're not quite as lengthy. I'm not going to demand quite as much from them. So, describe the process you've been engaged in to develop the thesis for your research paper. Have you felt overwhelmed by the sheer amount of data available? If so, how are you managing it? Have you been able to narrow your broad topic into a manageable research problem? If so, how did you accomplish this? If not, what steps are you planning to take to help yourself? What are your plans for the next several weeks to move your paper along? What support do you need or want? These are some examples, certainly not the full gamut of the sorts of things that you can ask students. And one of the questions that I've gotten, because I've been sort of out there trying to convince faculty that they need to do these things. And so when I've been doing faculty workshops talking about how they can integrate this in, one of the questions I get is, will students actually answer these? And will they really take the time to respond to all of this? And surprisingly, the answer is yes. They might not answer every single question on the list, but they're going to try really hard, actually, to answer as many of them as they feel some sort of connection with. And that's really all you're looking for. So here are some common points, and I put some additional on the handout that you all have received in your folder of some points that you might consider for reflection. There are some additional there. This is not an exhaustive list. There are brilliant people in this room, and I'm sure many of you will come up with other fabulous things that you would like to ask students about. So, I showed you that prompt. I'm going to share with you a sample response to show you that students really will respond to these things and give you a lot of really fascinating information to work with. So, in response to the prompt I showed you, The way I developed my thesis was fairly random. I had a very difficult time picking a topic, so I just started brainstorming about things I had read online. The idea of social responsibility and its benefit interested me, especially after reading Friedman's work arguing against companies doing this. I was also interested in looking at whether a company's motives for being socially responsible mattered to consumers. For instance, are people more concerned that a company donates or promotes a cause, or are they more concerned if the company is actually on board with a cause? Think Walmart versus Google. I know there's a lot of data out there, but to be honest, I haven't really done enough digging to get into the topic very much yet. I imagine there's a lot of theoretical information about social responsibility versus profit-driven enterprises, so it'll be interesting to read various opinions on the matter. At this point, I haven't narrowed my topic at all, but I surmise I'll have to at some point. Over the next several weeks, I plan to really get into the topic and find a number of good sources that can help the paper take shape and hopefully have a more narrow focus. The main support I need is knowledge of where I can find articles or books relating to my topic. I'm sure there are plenty of sources out there. It's just really intimidating starting the process for such a major project. That's amazing. And I have, hundreds of other responses that are very similar to that. It's so rich in information about exactly what the student is experiencing in that moment that I can see in trends over time what they're actually learning from doing this, which is, I think, what we're trying to get out of doing this type of assessment measure, that deep measure. So, ways that I've used this information, it provides that direct dialogue. I can look and say, gee, we had a lot of students who are really struggling with where to find information. Maybe I should come in and we should talk about that for a little bit. Maybe I should give them the opportunity to ask the question. It helps faculty, and this is a big one, when they're doing research-based assignments, they know in a lot of cases that they have problems or they see consistent problems with them. They're not quite sure why they're getting those problems. This is a way to provide that information to them with carefully crafted prompts. You can discuss experiences of students over time. If you start doing this consistently with a class, it provides some longitudinal information about a student's experience doing a particular assignment. And the main thing for assessment is you're going to take these responses and you're going to use qualitative techniques to code the responses. And this is a summer project. You do not do this. You do not do this while you are in the midst of teaching. But as a summer project, you get together a group of folks and you actually code the responses that students give you. And one of, I think, the biggest things, the most important things I've found in doing this is that students talk to librarians toward the beginning and middle of their process. Would everyone pretty much agree with that? Right, by the time they get to the end, they're kind of working solo or maybe asking their friends. We keep asking them for stuff at the end, and then they say, oh, librarians aren't very important. When I ask them in the middle of it, what I found is that something like 60% of students identify a librarian as an important individual in their research process. But I really like project information literacy. I'm sure you're all familiar with that report. When they surveyed, I think they got 11% of students identified a librarian as somebody important. So 11%. Not very impressive. I don't think any administrator out there is going to care. 60%, suddenly we're essential for what all of these students are doing. So by simply asking them at the right time, you can get radically different results. Okay, and the last thing, how do we do that thing where we convince the faculty to really do this? Well, first of all, faculty, especially newer faculty, which is one of the people you're going to target with this, are out there. They've been told they have to do assessment. They don't know what to do. They're ambling around. They've got all this stuff on their plate. They're thinking about their research agenda. Guess what? Here is something that you can offer to them. It helps them. It gives them assessment information as well as giving you assessment information. You can work together with the faculty to craft the prompts so that you can get all of the information you're looking for, and you're going to design the prompts, the things that you're asking the students, you're going to design them based on the shared learning outcomes that you agree on for the class. And it's really a wonderful thing. I have a little activity. How are we doing on time? Okay, wonderful. I'm going to give you guys about 5 minutes to ask me questions, and then we have an activity that I'm going to have you all do to work on developing some of these prompts, because what I have given you up here is just a tiny taste of the possibilities. So, are there any questions?
Karen, I'm sorry, I must have fell asleep at the beginning, but could you tell us what the environment is, the classes again, the numbers of students, when we're talking, you know, how often you meet, that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I've done a variety of things with this. I've done this at a couple of different institutions. So I've done this with classes from about 12 students all the way up to classes now. I'm working with one online, actually, doing this, where we have about 50 students. So I don't think it's probably scalable all the way up to the large lecture halls, unless maybe you have students do responses in groups, which might be a possibility. I've started thinking about that recently. But I've done it with a variety. I've been at smaller campuses. The campus I used to be at had an enrollment of about 1,800, and the one I'm at currently has an enrollment of about 3,200. And this isn't linked to a particular subject area, or I've done this with freshman composition to senior business students.
Could you just expound a little bit about the online experience?
So the online experience, basically what we did, it's actually for an online freshman composition course that the students are doing. So what we did is we actually used, we together developed the questions that we wanted to ask them. The instructor added me to the Blackboard shell so that I could read and respond to the responses, and we used the discussion boards to actually get students to respond to the prompts, and then they have a requirement as part of the class that they have to respond to each other. So the one tip, this is a tip on your handout, but one of the tips that I would give you is when you're working with a faculty member, in some way these responses need to be graded. They could be part of participation, they could be part of, you know, a grade as part of the larger assignment. I don't care, but some way they need to be graded, because it's the only way you're going to get them to take it seriously, at least initially. So, yes?
Do the faculty members also see their comments? And sort of the follow-up from that would be, do you think that you would get different reflections from the students if you assured them that the faculty member would not see the comments?
Yes, and yes. So, that's actually something, the second part of that, I wonder what would happen if they just sent them to me, is something that I've been thinking about more recently and kind of toying around with that, and I'm getting ready to give that a try this fall. So fingers crossed, I'm curious to see what sort of difference it makes. But, you know, truthfully, students have overwhelmingly been exceedingly honest. My favorite response of all time from a student, I had a student who had come to meet with me in my office to tell me about a topic they were thinking about for their research. And I looked at them and I said, you know, you just really don't seem like you're that into this topic. You might want to think about something else. We're at the beginning, you've got plenty of time to change. Is there something else you're interested in? And she wrote this amazing, like, 2-page response. And she recounted the story of this meeting we had. And she said, you know, for about 5 minutes, it made me really angry that you would tell me not to do something. But then I thought about it. And I didn't want to write about it because I don't want to write about anything, duh. But then I decided I probably should go in a different direction because I do really care about this. So here's what I'm going to do now. And so truthfully, you know, you get these, I mean, it's amazing. It is just amazing, the things that they will tell you. But that's my favorite responsible time, so yes.
Can you share any of the codes that you've used as you went through?
Yeah. That's been sort of a roving target over time, as I think these things are. But we coded around motivation. We've coded around particular source types that students have identified. We've coded around sort of anxiety in the research process, which is something that is really hard to get at. We've coded around how many times they've seen the librarian or reported librarian assistance, because that was a really important thing to us. Trying to think, there were, I think lately, the sample that I'm sharing from you, I've had like a 2-year process going on with the faculty member for this class at my previous institution, and we're getting ready to go and write this up and present this at the Academy of Management conference later this summer, because we think we have something to say about how business students research things at this point. But, you know, I think it depends a little on what you're looking to get out of it, what information matters to you. So, okay, we good? I think we're, oh, how are we? Yeah. Okay, one more. This is the last one.
It seems to me the criticism for reflective journaling here is it takes time to read all of this stuff and then to respond appropriately to the students, because they would deserve a response and putting all their effort into writing up their comments about the instruction. So how do you respond to that?
Well,
especially if you can imagine yourself in a larger environment.
Yes, well,
dealing with a couple of hundred students.
Yeah. First of all, I would say if you're dealing with a couple of hundred students, think about groups, because those might be your friend. I'm serious. But it doesn't take as much time as you think. It takes time to craft the prompts, and it takes some time when the students send in the prompts to read through them. But the reference desks where I've worked haven't been that busy, and I think we all have that problem a lot of times. And so honestly, I print them out and I use my time at the desk to sit there and make some notes for myself, and then any responses that I need to have, I do it. And so I was finding, you know, in a week where I would get the prompts back, I might spend like a couple hours reading them and responding to any comments, maybe 2 to 3 hours. So, you know, and that's 3 or 4 times a semester. So it's not, the sort of planning for the implementation is really what takes longer than the actual doing it. And then the coding takes a long time, which is why it's a summer project. So, okay, so here is your activity. I've got some markers up here, and you'll notice around the room, we've got stuck up these nice Post-it boards. I want you guys to form groups of about 5 people, I think is probably going to be our ideal number. About 5 people, and see in the next, how much time do we have?
Probably 5, maybe 10 minutes.
Say 5 to 10 minutes, what you can come up with that you might like to ask students to respond to. And I'll give each group a marker,